failing to turn it off at any point, we'll just hold that button down again.
Gotcha.
Could I find that for the intro?
Hey everybody. I'm Alex. Thank you for coming and supporting your local independent bookstore today. Your attendance and book purchases let us have events like this, and we really love them, so thank you. This evening we have the pleasure of hearing from Julie Kliegman about their new book, Mind Game, with Lindsay Gibbs. Julie is a writer and editor in Queens, New York. Their work has appeared in outlets including Sports Illustrated, The Washington Post, and many more. Kliegman's second book, Finding Renee, a biography of transgender tennis player Renee Richards, is due out in 2026. Lindsay Gibbs is the author and founder of Power Plays, a bi-weekly newsletter that adds crucial context to the biggest women's sports stories of the day. She was formerly the sports reporter at Think Progress, where she covered the intersection of sports and politics, and has written for many others in her nearly 15 years as a sports journalist. Well, thank you again, and you can find the book up front after the talk. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. This is so exciting. So, like I said, my name is Lindsay Gibbs, and it is my honor to be here with my good friend, Julie Kliegman.
Hello.
Hi, Julie. The day is here.
Yes.
So before we start talking about Mind Game, an inside look at the mental health playbook of elite athletes, I still have to look at the subtitle. Even though I literally wrote a newsletter about it, and every time I look at it, I have to recheck the subtitle. I thought we'd start off by saying, this is a talk about mental health, and I feel it's a little bit like a meeting, So my name is Lindsay, and I have anxiety and depression and ADHD, and have been managing those my entire life, basically, and dealing with mental health and both the day-to-day and the big picture are subjects that are very personal to me, and so I'm very fascinated in writing about it. And I also happen to be a sports journalist, so talking about it through the sporting context I think is really important, which is why I was so glad to hear that Julie was writing this book, and then to get to read it, and then to get to cover it and interview them for my newsletter, and then to get to be here. It's just really important and really special. But I want to start, Julie. First of all, I don't know if you want to start with your afflictions, but that would be good. Or you could leave me hanging. Either way. But yeah, just a little bit about yourself and why you decided to write this really important book.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. Really appreciate you being here. So I am bipolar, which is, kind of what sparked my interest in the book. I've been dealing with bipolar disorder for ages, since high school, since long before I knew what to call it or it was diagnosed or anything like that. I've always been into sports growing up, and just kind of marrying the two subjects felt really natural to me, especially because I find it so impressive when athletes do deal with this stuff and they make it at a level beyond high school. So I'm just so perpetually fascinated and amazed by that. So that's the short version of how the book came to be. You think I should read a couple pages?
I think that would be a perfect way.
Okay. Let's do it. I'll keep it short, I promise.
Did you forget to bookmark?
It's just the beginning of the introduction, so I really have no excuse. I will say before the introduction, hopefully if you pick up a copy of the book, you check out the foreword as well, which is by a WNBA player named Laisha Clarendon, who was amazing, and it was so cool of them to write the foreword. But I'll start from the words I actually wrote, and really just a couple pages here. Don't want to put anybody to sleep. But here we go. The introduction is called Learning from Our Idols. You know your favorite athletes' origin stories by heart. Dunking on the toy hoop, skating before they could walk, getting cut from the junior varsity squad. But do you know their mental health origin stories? The events that prompted them to speak up? Michael Phelps had the luxury of a magazine interview. Years later, Naomi Osaka had a skipped press conference. Simone Biles had the twisties. In other words, the gymnastics version of the yips, wherein her mind stopped being able to tell where her body was in space. Another Olympian, Raven Saunders, who is considerably less well known, had just a couple of wristbands, which we'll get to in a second. The Hulk, as they have long been called, had left their track and field career at Ole Miss a year early, in 2018. The up-and-comer's sudden departure came not even 2 full years after they took 5th place in the women's shot put at the Rio Games as a 19-year-old. Saunders was honored with a parade in their hometown of Charleston, South Carolina. But after that post-competition high came, she'd learn a pretty severe low. It's a fairly common experience among Olympic and other elite athletes. At the time Saunders dropped out of school, she'd been ready to kill herself. But just before she almost went through with it, one day in January 2018, she texted her former therapist, who told her to hang tight. The therapist helped Saunders check into a hospital, where she stayed for about 2 months. Although not everyone loves, or likes, or even tolerates psychiatric hospitalization, for Saunders, it was the greatest experience, they told me in 2022. I was tired of lying to myself. I was tired of thinking everything was okay when I went home and I had to close that door that I was struggling. Those are their words. By the way, they use she, her pronouns at the time I wrote this book, but it's since switched to they, them. So I'm trying to adjust on the fly. So those wristbands, they were hospital bracelets. They jump-started her willingness to go public with their experience of mental illness. Saunders, diagnosed with anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, had snapped a picture of their wrist at the time of her hospitalization and tweeted it 2 years later after reading a story of a college athlete who had died by suicide. So I'm going to quote Saunders' tweet. On 1/26/18, I was on my way to carrying out an attempt to end my life, the tweet goes. Their following on the platform had crossed 30,000 people by early 2023. And this is a quote again, "If not for sending a text to an old therapist, I would not be here right now. Every day I live is a gift because that day could have been my last." In a reply to that tweet, they added, "To everyone, especially all my student athletes out there, if you ever need to talk or feel that no one understands the pressures that you're under, my DMs are always open. It gets hard, but I promise you it'll get better." Saunders did get better, but their story around mental illness, like most of ours, athletic superstars are not, hasn't been linear or smooth. Their second Olympic go-around in Tokyo in 2021 came amid the COVID-19 pandemic. That time, Saunders earned the silver medal, outthrowing everyone, save China's Li Xiaogong. The Hulk, by then 25, demonstrated atop the podium, forming an X with their arms above their head. They later described the symbol as the intersection of where all people who are oppressed meet. Saunders has gone on to advocate for not only mental health awareness, but also racial and LGBTQIA+ justice. The medal marked a high moment for Saunders, but they almost immediately faced another tragedy. Their mother, Clarissa, died just 2 days after watching Saunders play second. She had been in Orlando at a watch party for her daughter, along with Raven's younger sister, Tanzania. Raven described Clarissa's death as putting them at their deepest level of hurt. But this time around, when things got tough, the athlete felt more equipped to move through and cope with their devastation. This is a quote, "This is how life goes. Something's going to happen, but whatever it is, I'll handle it," Saunders said, outlining their mindset leading up to the Tokyo Games. Quote, "And then my mother's death happened, and I was like, oh, we're going there." Saunders laughed to me in disbelief at the timing of it all. This go-around, they were able to implement the techniques they'd been building up to take care of their mental health, what they weren't equipped to do the first time around, when they were contemplating suicide 3.5 years before. They checked in with their therapist immediately on returning stateside, communicated with their family, and stayed aware of their triggers. Saunders' story is not one of a fairy tale recovery, a one-way trip from depression to perpetual happiness. Rather, like most of what's collected in this book, it's about the difficult slog of surviving on a daily basis. By hearing from elite athletes like them, we can better understand their origin stories and our own. I'll stop there because the next part is about my own experience, which I've already treated you to a little bit of. But yeah, Saunders actually competed in, Paris too, by the way, so.
That's incredible. I think a round of applause. I think we're going to talk about the Olympics today because I think it's so apt that we're coming on the heels of the Olympics, and
Yes.
a lot of these stories in the book revolve around the Olympics, which I think is really interesting. But I want to go back first. If you've been paying attention to the topic at all, it was in the past 5-6 years, you've had a slew might be a over dramatic word, but compared to what it was before, you've had Kevin Love, DeMar DeRozan, Naomi Osaka, some really high profile athletes talking about mental health, and we hadn't seen that before. But just because there's more of them concentrated now and there's starting to be a little momentum doesn't mean that they're actually the first. So I wanted to ask about some of the athletes that maybe 20, 30 years ago, when, before the stigma started to be chipped away at. I know one of the stories in your book that moved me the most is Jimmy Coldsfall, because of course I write about women's sports, big women's basketball fan, but there are a few in there. So I thought maybe if you wanted to tell people maybe a story that everyone doesn't know about some of the earlier athletes.
Yeah, well, cool. I think it's, by the way, such a great thing to point out that this story didn't start today. It didn't start 5 or 6 years ago. It certainly reached a fever pitch that we couldn't have anticipated. But these stories do go way back. Even beyond Michael Phelps, who I do highlight as one of the pioneers in the book. He was still relatively recent. There were a couple of New York Mets, which is, my baseball team. Sorry. Sorry to myself, mostly. There were a couple of New York Mets, one of whom really spoke out about his depression when I feel like no one was doing that at the time.
What year was
it was Pete Hernish in the 90s. And that was pretty remarkable. Who else? I mean, we were just talking about Royce White before this talk. He was a basketball player who declined to fly on airplanes with the team because of his anxiety. Initially, the league kind of accommodated him and then backtracked a little bit. Royce now has a second life as a far-right Republican politician. He just won a primary in Minnesota for Congress.
A different type of mental illness.
Wow. But yeah, so I mean, this is all to say, these people have existed, who are willing to speak out about mental illness and what they're going through have existed all along. It's more just the climate is now right for them to come forward, and we're actually kind of taking them seriously.
Why do you think it matters? I mean, anyone can talk about mental health. It's powerful if you and I sit here and talk about mental health, I think. But why does it really stick out when it's an athlete, an elite athlete?
So sports sports is celebrity culture. I firmly believe that. I feel like there are people who would maybe disagree, but they're some of our biggest stars, these athletes. And I feel like sports can also be one method of leading the way on progressive issues in society. We've seen the NBA take a lot of stands. Certainly we've seen the WNBA take a lot of stands for one. And, in the NFL, there was Colin Kaepernick speaking out about police brutality, along with WNBA players, by the way, around the same time. But yeah, so sports have always been kind of one vehicle for change because frankly, just so many millions of people pay attention to sports. And so for better or for worse, it kind of dictates where the culture goes or plays a part in that anyway. And people really want to get to know their athletes. That means they're looking for stories around them that need to be told. And so I think that is what I would say about why sports is an area to focus on. And they're also, these athletes are under so much pressure that these issues are things that affect all of us, like me and Lindsay, but Lindsay and I don't have the same platforms that Michael Phelps does. So I think it's really impactful when athletes speak up because people really listen.
And I think we idolize them so much, right? And I think of athletes as just being so mentally tough. I mean, I think it was Roger Federer who was talking about, he was giving this graduation speech recently, and he was talking about, I'm going to butcher this quote, but I'll just give an approximation about, how he had won 70% of the matches in his career or something big like that. But if you looked at it, he had only won like 55% of the points he had played. And so he had lost 45% of the points that he had played over his career. And I always think, like, as someone who a little bad thing happens in their day and it can throw me off for like a long time, right? Like if I sit down wrong in my chair, I can't write the newsletter, like what's going on? Like the amount of failure athletes are confronted on, and like quantifiable failure. Do you know what I mean? Like you're literally missing a shot. You made a foul you shouldn't have in a huge part of the game. Like their failures are front and center. They're happening in front of everyone. And even the best among them are going to have multiple failures in every single game or match that they play. And so to be able to bounce back from this, I just think you have to be the mentally strongest person in the world. And then to hear that even though you can be the mentally strongest person in the world and still have mental illness and still work with mental illness, to me, that's a really powerful like juxtaposition that kind of goes against the image we have of people who have depression or anxiety as being weak and frail and trapped at home,
Oh, completely. Yeah. Like I think part of mental toughness is actually being able to know when to pick your spots and be vulnerable, when to ask for help, when to take a step back from your job, even if your job is like playing professional sports. And also when to push through and push through the pain, as people say, and when to keep going. Like it's such a delicate balance that I think it absolutely requires a ton of mental toughness to pull off.
So let's talk about Michael Phelps, because I just do think that's such great. Like it's such a great example of, wins more medals than any Olympian times like 10, and reaches just these pinnacles, and then talks really candidly about the dark places that after every Olympics, like he would go to. And that's really, it doesn't fit our happy ever after storybook endings that we kind of like, we like to tell these stories that have the beginning and middle and end, but life in the micro doesn't work that way. And so what did you learn about how success impacts athletes like Michael Phelps? And with his story in particular, just what were your thoughts on his story in particular?
Yeah, so Michael Phelps, for those of you who may not know, after every Olympics, he's described that he basically had like a huge come down afterward. Like, we're all watching him compete. He's swimming super, super fast. He's winning all these medals. Like Lindsay said, a completely unprecedented number of medals. And yet, even he feels like this deep sadness, this depression afterward. And he went to, 5 Olympics? 4? At least 4.
10 maybe.
Yeah. And even he can't seem to quite find like this balance in his own life of being able to cope with the effects of like recovering from that attention and that like moment of pure bliss. Like it doesn't, I think people might be surprised to learn that someone in that situation could be depressed or is depressed. Michael's also been really open about his substance use. He's been to rehab. And I just think his story, it was kind of like I was trying to get at in the introduction I read to you with Raven Saunders and their experience, because it's just not so linear. Like it's not like you were saying, there's no firm beginning, middle, and end for most of these stories, if not all. So I think Michael's story is just an example of like, here's one of the most famous people on the planet, certainly one of the most famous athletes on the planet. And even he has trouble with this like 4-year Olympic cycle of like highs and like really awful lows. So if he's struggling and he has all this money and fame, like I think it's a really good experience for the rest of us to take note of.
Yeah, one thing, one of a therapist I was working with said this a couple years ago, and it like really stuck with me, that like success feels crappy, bad. Like success doesn't always feel good.
Yeah.
Success can feel uncomfortable and weird, and it can throw you off balance. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't strive for it, that you can't adjust to it. But I think very few people talk openly about that. So if you are a person like I never understood what was wrong with me, that when I had an article go viral or the newsletter was doing really well and everyone was praising me, I never understood why I hated those moments so much, and I assumed that there was something wrong with me, and I kind of hid from that, right? Whereas, since I've been able to, really realize like, no, that's okay that you felt uncomfortable with that. Like, don't compound it. And I think about that with like all the gold medals, like, and all of this fame, like you work so hard to reach this moment, but nobody talks about what happens afterwards. So I'm sure he felt at the time like beating himself up. Like, why do I feel so down? Like, why do I feel so down? What's wrong with me? When in reality, it's probably pretty natural.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I also like, this happens to even like less famous Olympians too, and less famous athletes. And it's like someone I talked to, like the goalkeeper for the Canadian women's national soccer team, she said it was like about a month before she even like could celebrate like her gold medal before she could even put it on, like, and like cheers with her partner. Like, I mean, and she didn't have nearly like half the spotlight that someone like Michael has, but it just goes to show like it affects everyone from the top all the way down.
Yeah, that I've thought about that a lot since reading her book, like her keeping that gold medal in her bag and being unable to even look at it until like months later, because it just didn't feel, it felt weird, it felt uncomfortable, and like she couldn't fully like comprehend it, because so much your identity is the striving, but what happens when you like catch the mouse, or
right,
anything.
what do you do now?
Like nobody, there is no playbook for that, really. Let's talk a little bit about like the struggles of the athlete experience in particular, and kind of ways that both fans, the media, teams, leagues, ways we would like to see athletes get more support for their mental health within their day-to-day. Because I think a lot of the athlete experience, like I said, I don't think it's not a mentally healthy environment. Like, it's high pressure all the time. Like you said, I remember Courtney Bankhart, the UNC women's coach, shout out, Chapel Hill, telling me like one time after a game, she just said the vulnerability it takes to be like a student athlete, to be like one of these elite athletes. And that like stuck with me, right? She was just like, the vulnerability it takes to like face South Carolina and be like, I can compete with Aaliyah Boston for this rebound. Like, I can do this. It takes a level of like vulnerability, and there's often not accommodations for like that level of vulnerability, right? Because vulnerability is seen as a weakness.
Yes.
So what did you learn about how teams and leagues have handled athletes who are dealing with depression or anxiety or bipolar? And, what through your work have you seen that works versus what would you like to see put in place?
Well, I think historically it's important for us to remember that, like, I mean, even around like 2000, I was, for the book, I talked to this guy, Gary Bennett, who is a sports psychologist at the University of Virginia, and he was hired part-time by the university in like around about 2000, and like he was like the only guy at the time, and like it's like, I don't know, maybe there were a few others a couple years later, but like it's not really until recently that we see someone in that kind of role at most like D1 universities. Some of them even have like, some of the Power 5 schools even have like departments. Like, I don't know, like look at Alabama. I mean, like Nick Saban cares about mental health, and that has meant that like Alabama football players have tons of access to mental health resources. But you know, that's certainly not true across the board. Like in colleges, it doesn't trickle down really to divisions 2 and 3. And on the professional level, there's like a whole, it's such a mixed bag, as I'm sure you know from talking to players and coaches, like what resources are available. I think it's great when schools have professionals on staff to treat mental health and address sports psychology. But I also think what I hear a lot from athletes is that they need more avenues outside of their jobs to seek this help. Because think about it, like you wouldn't necessarily want to go to a therapist or a psychiatrist who is employed also by your same employer. It's just awkward. Like there are confidentiality agreements, sure, and you think you can trust the person, but there might always be that like lingering thought in the back of your head, like what are they going to tell the GM? Am I going to get traded? Am I going to get cut from the team? Am I going to get benched? Is the coach going to find out? So I think like what we're seeing now is a lot of players, especially in leagues that are like where the players are really underpaid, like the NWSL, like those players want money to like go outside of the league and find their own professionals without having to pay them like exorbitant amounts of money. So I think that's kind of like the next frontier. And also just like, yeah, getting better treatment all around from the leagues in ways that aren't necessarily like squarely mental health issues. Like the better they get treated in all regards, like the better their mental health is going to be.
Labor unions.
Yeah.
There's a big news story, is it this week, last week, I think, that the National Women's Soccer League had a new collective bargaining agreement, and it's the most like player-centric collective bargaining agreement I think like we've ever seen in sports. And to me, you know, I was talking with Julie before this about, you know, how women's sports, you've heard it's been a place where a lot of abuse has festered and a lot of mental health and mental illness, a lot of burnout, because, you know, these athletes have been told to just accept the crumbs that they're given and to be grateful for whatever they have. You don't make us money, we don't earn money from you, so accept this and don't complain, swallow your feelings, like, and move on. Whereas like in this CBA, players have to like, first of all, there's no draft, so players have a lot more agency in where they go and where they sign. And there are no trade clauses, which I think is huge for mental health, to be able to have these things. That doesn't mean it's going to be like, you know, the environment's not one with kid gloves, and nor should it be. It's professional sports. It is what it is. But I just think it's really interesting to think about the ways that making things more player-centric, giving players more of a voice, you know, will make the environment safer and better for everyone.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean by like addressing issues that aren't like squarely about mental health, like literally hiring a psychiatrist. It's like all these other things, like getting to choose the city you live in. Like these are things that a lot of us have, and if not, a lot of us want to have. And you know, professional athletes are no different in that regard.
I've got a few more questions, but does anyone else have questions?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate everyone coming out. So like, if you know, there's something you want to make sure we hit on, like we're here for that.
I have a question. Yes. And in the spirit of the meeting, my name is Caroline. I also live with bipolar disorder.
Nice.
And I have a question about, in the research and the writing of your book, what you may have found regarding like shared strategies that elite athletes have when they're performing at a high level. During the last Winter Olympics, there was a young ski jumper whose name I'm not going to remember, but I remember she got some popularity because she does these visualizations before she does a jump, and she visualizes herself doing it perfectly, kind of in order to increase and enhance her performance. And I think there's also been some studies on that practice and it actually yielding like better results. So I'm curious if you found kind of anything like that. I'm also thinking about the Netflix docuseries I just finished watching called Sprint. There was like some different athletes on there who basically were saying, you know, in order to be the fastest person in this sport, or to believe that you can be, you have to believe that you're a god. Like, you have to have this almost godlike, mentality about yourself. So I'm curious if you found any kind of like patterns or trends among like crossing different sports about what athletes do to like get themselves to that place.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think like it's certainly true that most of what these athletes do is not like specific to their sport. So there are a lot of cross-sport trends. Visualization, as you mentioned, is certainly a big one. But it's funny because everyone thinks visualization is just like closing your eyes and like Kate Fagan told me this, the former ESPN journalist. She played basketball at Colorado, and she was saying like everyone thinks it's like a 10-second thing you do like before you go to sleep. You just close your eyes, you imagine the ball going into the hoop, and it's like great, you're happy and you win the game. And it's like that, like that's not how it works. But like visualization, if you really put a lot of like time into it and have someone guiding you in particular, that can be a really great thing. And there's been some interesting research that like the more you like, I forget the term for it, but the more you can like reenact like your sport. So like if you're a rower, like if you practice, like if you sit up and like act like you're rowing, like even if you're in bed or on the floor or something, that's more effective than just lying down and not moving your arms at all and trying to visualize yourself winning the race. But yeah, like also like Bianca Andreescu, the 2019, I believe, US Open champion in tennis, she talked to me for the book, and she was like all about visualization. In terms of other things, I think the big thing that I hear athletes talk about all the time is like mindfulness and meditation. I mean, like meditation is so like mainstream now that like LeBron James like meditates, and like everyone
doesn't he respond like have one of those like the apps, isn't he like with like the Calm app or something?
Right, yeah, like I don't know, I just think when it's at a level where like guys like that aren't afraid of being seen as like dorky or whatever when they do that stuff, it's pretty neat. So yeah, I think those are the two big things I see across sports in terms of like mental skills strategies, but also just like using a mental skills coach in general, like that's a huge trend. And so just like really, I think we're only starting to see like what trends are emerging because athletes are only now just talking about it more.
That's a great question. Any other questions? I want to know what your favorite interview was for the book.
Oh, that's a great question. Chloe Kim, the snowboarder, she was really fun to talk to. She's just so cool, and like, you're just like talking to a normal person, it feels like. And
that's so weird because like that this whole thing is like us being like athletes are like so different.
Right. Like they are right. Like she was taking breaks from snowboarding to go to college. Like it's just like and live a totally normal life with some anonymity for her, she hopes. That's what she does between Winter Olympics. It's pretty incredible. So that was definitely one of my favorite interviews. Yeah, there are so many though. Like I don't even know. My brain just like all has them like filed away and some like
you haven't.
But Chloe was a great interview.
That's a good one. What about Leisha? Let's talk about Leisha, who is one of the favorites of both of us. So they wrote the foreword, like you mentioned. They're a WNBA player and really trailblazing the LGBTQIA plus community, and is being like a transgender player. And I thought, and very outspoken also on racial justice. And I thought that the way he described intersectionality and that impact on mental health was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Leisha is really interesting because they're involved in many different causes. They also have like a young kid, so they're kind of just exhausted and pulled in all these different directions all the time. And I think actually the last few games they've been on a mental health break on the injury report with a like mental health day.
Oh,
right?
interesting. I know they're dealing with injury, so
Yeah,
I don't know if
at
it's
least
injury.
One of those games was cited as a mental health day.
Okay, that's a big thing that the W has kind of added into its lexicon. Like,
Right.
They literally like DNP mental health.
Mhm,
Like,
mhm. Yeah, that was the title of like Liz Cambazia's. I mean, that's a whole other story, but
I know I wasn't going to mention that.
yeah, but that was literally the title of the Players Tribune essay from a former WNBA player about like how she wished the injury report could have read,
Yeah.
and now we're closer to that spot. But yeah, Laisha, I think it's important to recognize that the athletes who do all these social justice causes, it's like an extra full-time job kind of. It's not just like a core part of being an athlete. It's like, no, you're taking on all this extra responsibility. You're being looked up to as a spokesperson. And on Laisha, there's a lot of pressure for being the first transgender and non-binary, the first openly transgender and non-binary player in WNBA history. So there's a lot of eyes on them. There's a lot riding on their shoulders. There's, they haven't always had the greatest experience at previous stops in the WNBA. So I think that can take a huge, huge mental health toll.
Yeah, and just it seems like for them, they were out of the league for a little bit and then came back in, and being in an environment now where their trainers and coaches can recognize when they're struggling and openly be like, hey, do you need to sit out? Like, are you okay? Like, just that seems to have freed them up to play some really great basketball lately, which is another, I mean, we could go on for another full 30 minutes, we won't, about like the mind-body connection and the way that manifests in athletes as well. What interview, I'm gonna keep asking about your interviews, even though I know
fine.
they're just like, but like, which one kind of like moved you the most? Like,
hands down, the former U.S. gymnastics star Michaela Maroney.
oh, please tell us all about that. Yes.
Yeah, so if you remember her, it might be for her gymnastics, or it might be because she went viral with like the not impressed face that she made in like one of the photos where she was receiving a medal. And so everyone really latched onto that, was like, oh my God, she's getting a medal, and she's like not even happy about it.
She in the team competition in the 2016 game, or 2016 I think, or was it 2012?
I think it was 2012.
I think 2012. She hit the most perfect vault you will ever see. I literally go back on YouTube and watch this vault that she hit during the team competition. It beat Simone Biles' vault, which I know what a big deal that is. Like, I do not say that lightly. And then, so she was like gonna get gold in the vault competition, because this was like the best vault anyone had ever seen. And then she like had a stumble like on the vault, and so she got silver, because even like her stumble still gets her silver. But so she makes the not impressed face, and then she ended up making it with Obama and everything.
Oh my God,
like
but when she made it with Obama, it was a big deal too, because people thought she was disrespecting the president when she was just referencing the meme.
We did not fully understand the internet in 2012. Like, memes were very new, and everyone was really weird about it.
Yeah, completely. But yeah, so she really moved me because she talked a lot about the harassment that comes along with being a viral meme, and also about the abuse that she and other gymnasts face at the hands of Larry Nassar, and how that affects mental health when you've been through a harrowing experience like that. So we talked for a long time, and it was, I was just really grateful how open she was. Really how open all the athletes I talked to were with sharing their stories. A question I get a lot actually is like, was it really hard to get people to open up to you? And it wasn't nearly as hard as I was expecting. Like, yes, you have to build trust with your sources as a journalist, and like, you're not just gonna hop on the phone and be like, tell me your deepest secret or whatever. But I think people really are eager to speak out. They're eager for people to listen. Like, things have definitely changed. And yeah, Michaela is just one great example of that. And I think about that interview a lot, even though, it was many years ago now.
Yeah, because she's, I think, like you said, she got memeified and kind of then turned into, you know, very dismissed, right?
Right.
Like,
Oh, and she was also injured when that picture was taken. Like she was competing in those Olympics on an injury.
and
on top
in the
everything.
midst of being sexually abused by Larry Nassar. Like,
Right.
like literally the night before. Like, it's awful. You never know what people are going through.
No, truly. Yeah, like it's a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason.
Absolutely. 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap up. I think we're doing good. Unless there are any other questions.
Yes. You started one of your questions around the media, and now that we're talking about social media, I'm just curious to hear, like, then as compared to now, what is it like to be as open about with literally everyone listening, and what is the responsibility of the media in telling the story of athletes?
That's a great.
I know you're both journalists. So.
Yeah, I'll get started, and then you can chime in, Lindsay, as you see fit. Yeah, as we were saying, like the difference even since 2012, and that was already like a social media era, until now is pretty extreme. And if we go back even further, like the Mets players I was talking about, like their options were either talk to reporters in a press conference or don't talk at all, basically. Don't get your story out there. But now there's so many more options, and I think that can be a really good thing. Like a lot of players I talk to prefer Instagram for sharing mental health updates, for example. I've written about this in the book, but there's a site called the Players Tribune that's like not quite journalism, but it's like
It's not journalism.
It's not journalism, but it is like a chance for athletes to tell their stories in a way that they're comfortable with. Like, is that a good thing or a bad thing for the press? Like, I don't really know. I don't feel qualified to weigh in on that fully, but the reality is it means there are more places for athletes to tell their stories. But there are also more places for athletes to be harassed and for athletes to like feel like they're just like pawns in someone else's like gambling scheme, or like, something like that. So that's like kind of my spiel on social media. And then like as media members, I think it's like incumbent upon us to make sure athletes want to talk to us, to be like trustworthy people that athletes feel they can open up to. It's harder to get their attention now when they can just post on Instagram instead. But I think they go to Instagram because they feel like they want their story posted in their own words. So I do feel like athletes will still come to the media if we present ourselves as responsible and compassionate and empathetic, and like we're good, storytellers and good liaisons to the public for those stories.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I always think, like, yes, it can be, you do as a journalist when athletes can just go somewhere where they're not going to be fact checked at all, and they're not going to be, nobody's going to push back or question them. Because I always tell athletes before I interview them, like, I will have to fact check your story, and that's to protect you. Like,
Right.
That's actually me protecting you. And also, like, if there's things in here that don't make sense, I'm going to question it. And once again, that's to protect you, because once it's out there, but that can be a really uncomfortable process. And
Yeah, and also like to Lindsay's point, like everyone has inaccuracies when they tell their own stories, like, and that's like doubly true if you've been through something really traumatic. Like your memory is not going to function correctly 100% of the time. It's just you're human.
Yeah, but I think, a rule I always had when I was beat reporting, or now that I kind of just I kind of cover things through a national lens and pick and choose the stories that I do throughout the whole women's sports world. But I always like use instead of being like, oh, they've told this story, right? They tweeted that they are dealing with depression, or they did an Instagram post explaining this trauma they went through. I look at that as an opportunity to then follow up with them, because I think a lot of times, like, you do, if you're putting it out there already, like, you want to be asked about it, right? And you have to approach it like delicately, of course, and don't put them on the spot in a big press conference. Give them a way out of the conversation. This is how I deal with any sensitive issues with athletes. But I've always said, like, I will ask an athlete about, like, activism or this political thing if they've started the conversation through their social media, right? I'm not going to go up to any athlete and say, are you pro-abortion? Right? Like, go for me. But if they make a pro-abortion post, pro-choice post on their Instagram, like, I might go up and ask, do you want to expand on that or something like that? And the same if I have a daily relationship with them, if I'm a beat reporter and they they share something that indicates that they're struggling, I might, not in front of a bunch of people, but just say, hey, I want to check in on you with that. I think you have to, like, let them know that you're people, and you have to take that really seriously. Like, telling someone's story it's a big deal, and I think it's taken really lightly and not necessarily intentionally. I do think a lot of times with reporting, it's not malice, it's just like the nature of the beast and the churn. But I really think it's important to keep mental health stuff as part of the conversation if an athlete brings it up, right? And keep going back to it and follow up on it. And if you're going to ask about a knee pain or if you're going to ask how an injury's thing, take away that stigma, and like I said, don't put them on the spot, but let them know you are open to talking with them about it. And I think that's a really great way to build trust, and it really helps get better, more nuanced stories out there. Because I think, to go back to your book and to go back to kind of like the whole thing, really what we want to do here is just change the narrative and make it much more complex. It's not that the narratives out there are wrong, they're just not complete, and so I think that, by putting all these stories together, what you've done such a good job of is just showing, how complex this is and how varied the stories are. But, it goes a long way. Taking away the stigma goes a long way.
Thank you.
Other questions? Hi, Mitchell.
Can you tell us about the book you're working on now?
That was my next question. Good job.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you. So the reason I'm in North Carolina is I got a research grant from Duke's library system to research part of my next book, which is going to be a biography of the tennis player Renee Richards, who came out as trans in the 1970s and sued successfully for her right to play in the women's draw of the US Open in 1977. So I'm really excited about that. Duke holds some material from someone who was going to write a biography of her a long time ago. And so I have access to all these notes and transcripts and photos and not emails, wow. Letters.
Instagram posts.
I mean, that'd be a really big scoop. So that is the thrust of the book. I've been in touch with Renee. She is 90 years old, living in New York, and she's been really gracious with her time and generous, just like setting aside like hours of time for interviews and for me to flip through her scrapbooks and everything like that.
Well, nobody wants to talk about trans women in sports. It's not a topic that anyone has any interest or that riles anyone up on any side of the conversation. So I can't imagine there's going to be any interest in that. No.
God help us.
God help us all. We have to laugh or we will just cry. And there's nobody better to tell that story than you. I was so excited when I found that was your next book.
Thank you. Yeah, I can't wait.
All right. Well, I think with that, hopefully we'll meet back here in a few years.
That sounds great. I'm down.
All right. Sounds
Thank
good.
you,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone. This was so good.